Okay, so if you guys, those of you guys, I just want to tell a little bit about my story, and then Patients Like Me, what Patients Like Me is, and then I'm going to talk a lot about what some of the examples that we've done to when you engage patients in the way that we have. So just so you know, I have two brothers. This is my brother Stephen, who unfortunately passed away in 2006 from Lou Gehrig's disease. And our family did two things. We started a nonprofit institute that does hardcore in vivo drug discovery, large scale. They've run about 25,000 SOD1 mice through that lab in the last 10 years. And we started Patients Like Me. Just talking about TDI for a second in terms of why, and you know, a lot of what our colleagues, my colleagues today talked about is why the sort of the bent on which we started Patients Like Me. So Jamie, when he started, my other brother Jamie, when he started TDI, was trying to find a drug for Stephen to put in him. And so he was doing preclinical mouse work and kept trying to replicate the evidence in the literature and was unable to do it. And so he kept trying and trying and trying. And after spending about $50 million trying to find something that worked and having false positives and not replicating any of the literature, he actually took his database of control mice and ran Monte Carlo simulations of all of the published literature, which was about 2,400 mice at the time, and discovered that 90+% of the published studies were in the results were likely due to unaccounted unaccounted phenotype in the noise floor of the mouse. So again, not understanding the phenotype in a way that random chance likely resulted in those preclinical results, which in ALS jumps right to clinical studies. So that's kind of the bent on what we started Patients Like Me, and actually really with the idea that in order to really understand what works, whether it's interventions, drugs, care, or whatever, we really need to understand and characterize and make the human condition computable. And so we need to understand deeply the human phenotype longitudinally. So that's not what our website looks like. If you go to it, it's a community where we encourage patients to come together, track their disease progress, but not just sort of share stories, but actually track structured quantitative data about outcomes, treatments, symptoms, all online, shared in a community setting where they can find other patients like you. Again, not just MS patients or autism patients or other patients, but an MS patient who's 43, experiencing leg spasticity, taking baclofen. I can find that patient on the system. I can connect with them. I can see how they're doing. I can track their outcomes, and I can look at how those aggregate up. And again, all of that data is aggregated up for patients to look at and engage in. So the last 10 years, we've really spent, we started in 2004. I like to say Facebook was the Facebook back then, but they've grown a little faster than us. But we've really spent the last 10 years doing exactly this problem, which is engaging patients deeply in their health, their own data, and the research process. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we focus on to be successful in that environment, and also some of the things that are possible. So just quick numbers. I won't dwell on this, but we've grown to about 320,000 plus patients in the networks across 2,300 different conditions. We're much deeper in some of our earlier conditions, like we have 45,000 fibromyalgia patients, 30,000+ MS patients, 7,000 plus ALS patients. Again, all this data is structured in the system. It's coded back to ICD 9 and 10, SNOMED, MEDRA. And we're doing more and more third-party integration, which I'll talk a little bit about. 60+ peer-reviewed papers at this point in time, with about 20 in the hopper. So we're publishing out of this, and I'll talk about why that's important. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those other things on the right today. So just as we think about this, and this is on the life sciences side, people are saying it's important to engage patients, understand them, but we're not really doing it. This is from a forum of VPs of clinical ops leaders who are saying, how do they actually design trials and who do they use as inputs? And you'll see, down the very bottom, patient interviews is just one. And that's just actually just bringing a patient to the table, not necessarily thinking about and understanding and quantifying the patient experience so that you can use it more systemically. But as we've studied and the IOM study, this is a study that we replicated, an IOM study we replicated on our site. Patients really are willing to share. 94% or plus are willing to share their health data with the doctors to improve care. Same with researchers, and that's despite 76, I think it was 76% of patients were worried about what could happen with sharing that data. So despite that, still a real desire to help. So there is opportunity here to really bring patients into the equation. So let's get back to what I think some of the challenges. We started with Keaton talking about the IT infrastructure that we're going to need to build, talked a little bit about some of the tools and analytics and some of the opportunities when we begin to bring these data sets together. But I think one of the problems we have today is we really need to think about what patients care about. And this is just an example for my brother, right? So the system measures forced vital capacity, muscle wasting, facilitation. But what he cares about is this stuff down the bottom. And what we need to begin to think about is systems and scaling ways of taking the things patients care about in the end and scientifically bringing that back and tying that back to the clinical evidence and understanding. And so that's a lot of some of the work we've done in terms of building systems that can do that. One example of that is the Open Research Exchange we built with a grant from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is an open collaborative environment for developing patient-reported outcome measures. We built that over the last couple of years. We've developed 13 measures with collaborators in that environment. And again, focusing a little differently on the problem. Instead of thinking about system measures or global health or even clinical measures necessary that the doctor might start, we really want to think about measuring from the patient standpoint and what they care about. And these are some of the things we're trying to bake into the system and understanding some of the attributes that we care about for measurement. Now, but just taking that one level further, again, I think it is our responsibility not just to think about how to get patients to share data. I mean, that's been the model of research forever, right? I mean, we reach out to patients, we ask them questions, we share data. Donating data is good, and we have a campaign around Data for Good for donating data. That's a very valuable thing. But ultimately, you actually have to figure out ways of creating value for patients, and you have to push the limit on what that actually means to engage patients. So this was one of the projects we did in the Open Research Exchange where patient-led from soup to nuts, the whole process of developing a pain scale, working with our researchers using the platform. And again, that may not be where we go, but pushing that system allows us to understand what's possible and as we begin to think about engaging patients. Another thing, just thinking about scale, and if those of you guys in the those of you guys who think about PROs at all, I mean, there's a thing called cognitive debriefing where you sit with a patient taking a survey and you ask them about what they're thinking to try and understand the gaps in the survey or what's hard to understand. The system, what we built into Open Research Exchange is a way of scaling that. So and structuring that. So with each question and each survey, we ask them, was it understandable? Do you have feedback? And that metadata is all captured in Open Research Exchange. So as we develop more and more scales or prompts or even items about how we ask questions of patients, that shared learning will actually create value for future decision making of those scales. Again, lots of patients desire to work with life sciences companies and trials. No shortage of opportunity there. So this is some work we're doing. The FDA has this patient-focused drug development. The last couple of meetings where they bring patient advocates together and try and capture the patient voice to inform the regulatory process. We've been bringing data, structured data from our communities to those meetings. But I put this up here as something just to think about. We spend as much time thinking about what the value is and why you would engage and how you invite and how you engage patients in that process as we do the downstream thing. So I mean, you guys heard about, obviously Apple's research kit came out. I think that solves a lot of the problem from when you have patients using your app down the stream in terms of collecting data and doing things. I'm not sure it actually does anything to the upstream part of the thing of engaging patients in the research, telling them why it's valuable for them individually or why it's valuable societally or both, ideally. And so we spend a lot of time and effort on that, and I think that's an important part of that process, and researchers generally do not. So this is just some structured data that we're bringing back in. Again, the fibromyalgia FDA thing had less than 100 patients on the web, and the other things, and in person, very valuable to get that patient voice. It's better. Bringing patients to the table is a good first step, but taking the responses of 1,000+ fibromyalgia patients and understanding that is a scalable and more significant way to do it, and I'll talk about why getting that scale is important. because how patients think about this is just patients' experience with trials and thinking about trials. Varies across condition, what patients care about. So that's interesting. We probably can, everyone here would think that that's useful and would say that's, that makes a lot of sense. But more importantly, when you get to scale and you think about this product, those experiences or input into trial design might vary by severity of condition. And so again, we need to begin to think about taking this patient experience and scaling it and doing it at scale, not just sort of bringing them in. And I think one thing we think a lot about is as these data sets come together, as this phenotypic data comes together, as omic data sets come together, I don't think it's just about collecting this data for researchers. I think we really need to begin to think about how we enable first of all, the bleeding edge patients and then further down the stream. And I think that's some of what Catherine's talking about. I think that's a very exciting that patients can log in, they can utilize the tools themselves, and then actually in that engagement, then think about how they might share and use that more broadly with researchers. Again, sometimes, on the trial side, sometimes it's just the simple things that we need to do. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. So this is data from our system on lupus. The ends are over here. This is just collected longitudinally over time. This is patient severity. I think there's a couple of things that are interesting. So typically, it's presented in the clinic as a rash. It's measured around clinical evaluation of of effects on various organs. But patients don't experience lupus around organ failure or organ distress. They experience the symptomology. And we call this our symptom sandwich internally. But this for lupus versus some of these other conditions we have in our system, which from an outside might think are much worse conditions, this level of severe symptomology is very high, and this level of no symptoms is very low for any disease in our system. And there's some takeaways here, right? So one is really focusing on pain. That's a big part of what patients talk about when they talk about. So flares are often talked about in lupus clinically, but patients are really focused on pain. And so we need to think about that more than just pain joint, but we'll really break it down into what kinds of pains and how we might think about it. Additionally, fatigue is a big deal. It's the second biggest thing. Now it's a step down from pain, but a lot of the treatments for pain cause fatigue. They cause tiredness. So clinically, as you're thinking about this, we need to actually begin to address this in the context and then on the trial and on the life sciences side, begin to think about measuring this and understanding this in trials. I mean, just for example, the only patient-reported outcome in trials, insomnia has never been measured in lupus trials. SF36 is the typical patient-reported outcome measure that's used in trials that I think has one question on pain. So again, doesn't get to some of the key issues that patients care about. Again, just when you begin to have the sort of data at scale, you can do some interesting things. This is some new work we're doing around sort of tolerability of drugs and patients staying on drugs. This is it's not really a Kaplan-Meier, but pseudo-Kaplan-Meier curve where we show whether patients stay on drug in the presence of a side effect. And so this is a lot of the drugs in the systems look like this. The side effect doesn't change whether or not they're on drugs or whether they stay on drugs, which again, tolerability and staying on drug relates to outcomes and adherence. But then you look at something like prednisone in our system and makes me very edgy or edginess. Over half the patients who have that side effect are off the drug within 100 days. So thinking about that both on the clinical side and then on the in terms of finding the right treatments for patients, as well as on the life sciences side, whether or not we should be understanding that, tracking that for trials as well. Lastly, just talking a little bit about investing in some of this thing. So, I mean, I think about 2 years ago, we started building an IPF community. We actually did it in conjunction with Boehringer. In the last 3 months, 2 drugs came on market in that relatively rare disease. And so IPF is a really relatively immature research infrastructure as a community, both from the clinical side, from the life sciences side, from the patient side. It doesn't have the advocacy. It doesn't have the clinical infrastructure or networks, and it doesn't have so these drugs are coming on market, and there's a huge opportunity to learn from patients. And so what we did when those came on market, we actually started a research study to actually understand the real world results of those as patients came on the drugs. Again, this is a relatively rare condition. Physicians often see less than this number, but this is our data early, about a month in terms of collecting data about side effects from various trials, real-world side effects of these 2 drugs against the label side effects. So you see that there's some real differences as we do it. And I think more interestingly, again, with patient input in terms of informing both the clinical side as well as post-market surveillance for the drug side, not just whether or not they had the symptom, but whether it got better and the time to improve. And so for patients to make better decisions about, hey, I'm on this, I'm experiencing this side effect, but I know it might actually dissipate after 4 weeks, I have a window where to think about staying on, trying it out, and making sure, seeing if it works for me. So again, but that takes investing in and thinking about these networks and connecting these data sets and patients. And now what we're doing in IPF is going to the clinic and building KOL networks as well as registries to allow this to actually expand and integrate the patient-reported and phenomic data we're collecting to the clinically collected data as well. Lastly, we talked a little bit sensors. Keaton talked about in his opening some of the work we need to do. I think, again, just going back to measurement and understanding it, I would say 97% of the devices that are on market today will not exist in 5 years. So as we think about the clinical relevance, if we think about the use of them to measure and understand disease, we have to begin to tie them and validate them and think about them in the context of the illnesses and see what's possible. So again, a couple of points here. Just thinking about the out-of-box experience, we spent a lot of time engaging patients. So we did an MS study, over 200 patients in 24 hours, but getting 85% of MS patients to actually link that Fitbit to their Patients Like Me profile so we could collect that. And again, I think we did about 2,500 communications across that study, and then ultimately getting the data on the back end. I think we have to take our time to really understand the clinical meaning, the patient meaning of these new DTC devices. I mean, for example, with every pedometer on the iPhone uses a different algorithm from the raw data of the chip to calculate your steps. So you're going to get difference. And is that significant? Is that error significant or not significant? Similarly with diabetes apps, most of them in terms of recommendation of glucose levels are black box. You don't know what the algorithms are. They should probably all be white box so we can actually do QA on them and understand them. So this is that study published recently. So I'm going to end with this, guys. We talked a lot about it. I think we have found in our work in the last 10 years, patients really have the same 6 questions no matter what they have. I like to say patients don't have research questions, they have questions. So as you're thinking about engaging them in research or asking them to share their data, I think you need to think about answering these questions for them and actually providing value to that, whether it's in the near term or the long term. These are, again, this is one of the ways we anchor ourselves back. Are we helping to answer these as we're building this data set and understanding for longer term research? Are we helping them answer these in the near term? Because again, ultimately, what we really need to do is take the patient experience and raise it to the level of medical evidence. And there's a lot of steps along the way. But starting with answering their questions today is one of the ways to do it. So lastly, I'll just leave with this. This is a haiku by one of our people. I think there's huge opportunities around engaging patients. I think it's not just about getting data, though. I think it's about helping them get their data, understand their data, and through that process, you gain the insights from that data as well. And I think we need to do that whole continuum really to do this right.